I'm Kirk Hanson. I'm Executive Director of the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. And we have as our guest today Mike Schroeder. Mike is Senior Vice President for Human Resources for Rambus Corporation. Mike is one of the most seasoned human resources executives in the Valley, having worked in a number of Silicon Valley firms and having risen to his current position. Mike, you've had the responsibility in a number of organizations for creating the ethical culture of the organization. What are the main barriers to creating such an ethical culture?
Well, I think, Kirk, it started with making it relevant to all the people in various different departments of the company. Not everybody immediately understood, or in fact, most people believe that they're very ethical to begin with. And our task was really to set out, look, we want to make a more ethical, more values-driven type of culture here that's sustainable and maybe reflects where we are today rather than where we were maybe 10 years ago. So the challenge was to make it relevant to each group, and starting off with your help, of course, we sat down and looked at, well, let's talk about what does it mean. Let's talk about some stories, and let's use real examples in the organization, and then let's further reinforce this by saying, look, well, what do you mean? What do you mean by ethical culture? And I think when you boil that down, you end up with, well, what are the behaviors that you would associate with being ethical? How do you want to be experienced as a coworker, as a customer, as a supplier? And we set into describing what that would look like. And the process actually became pretty self-reinforcing, starting with that approach, because it reduced the resistance that there might be, in people who said, well, wait a minute, are you trying to fix me? And the answer was, no, we're not trying to fix you. We're trying to understand how we can make this place better and how we can, sustain, our values, into this next generation of the company we're trying to create.
How do you balance establishing an ethical culture which is focused on aspirations or values and an ethical culture that is focused on compliance and making sure the organization meets the minimums? How do you do that?
Well, we started with a clear-eyed understanding that there were some aspirational goals that we needed to include because they clearly weren't present in the areas that we encountered the difficulties that we were trying to address as a management team. So that part, again, if you think about it logically, was kind of easy. The challenge was, once you got started, where do you draw the line? How large of a dose, can you deliver in the first foray, and how do you keep the thing from becoming overwhelming? Because compliance is, as you know, and ethical issues, can be quite vast. And our decision there was to take a look at, well, what were some of the issues of special concern to our company? What were some of the issues that we're likely to encounter in the future? And we tried to focus in those areas in terms of our current business to make it as relevant and time-bound in the current time as possible.
You first went to Rambus as the Senior Vice President for Human Resources and began the process of explicitly managing the ethical culture now 6-7 years ago. What kind of challenges arise over time or have arisen over this period of time in keeping that culture alive?
Well, the challenge comes when you start to move to more online training annually to reinforce the code of conduct, where the values training gets blended into onboarding, which works great when you're hiring a lot of people, but when you start to go down in hiring at times, it's more of a challenge to make sure that people are all getting the total message around, what do we mean by, not just compliance and code of ethics, but what are our values and why are they our values? That's further complicated over time, as you know, when you have a new CEO come on board, and the new CEO has their own style and their own values. And the question is, how well do the stated values of the company now stack up with the behavior that's being evidenced in the senior staff meeting and in other aspects of how we're running the business. I think it's important at that point to have a very open dialogue and find out how are there disconnects. If there are disconnects, why is that? Has the business shifted? Is the emphasis slightly different? The good news for us was there was very little disconnect and very little delta in any of that.
Isn't it true that sometimes when there's a new chief executive, employees sit around and wait for signals that indeed the same values do apply under the new leadership? How do you deal with that? How do you give them that assurance?
Well, I tell stories. It's interesting. I relay actual situations where, our CEO would say something along the lines of, well, if somebody did that, of course we would, we would fire them. Or we, I'm not interested in hearing about approaches like that. This is, or more on the positive way, look, we're trying to accentuate, a different look for the company with our partners. And he told a great story about diving into a contract. He happened to know the general counsel of one of the companies that we were trying to work with, and he read the contract himself, and he goes, guys, we still have language like this in the contract. How do you think a sane person on the other side of this deal would interpret this language, and why is it here? And when they dug deeper, they found out, well, it's there because we always put that in for extra flexibility and protection in the past. He goes, well, that's clearly not needed now. And that sent a very positive message into the contracts and legal team that we have to look and be capable of reframing all this stuff, and we want to be very consistent with this value that's emerging, which is making Rambus easier to do business with, less mysterious and more valued for what we do at our core type of company.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Kirk.